Okay, today we have Diane Croft, who is the author of The Unseen Partner, and she will be speaking with us live at 2 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time. There will be no replay and no live stream for this event. So if you are interested in attending, you must register within the next 2.5 hours, let's say, and you must attend on the Zoom session only. And it's going to be a very profound session. It's experiences of God in the individuation process. And this will be the first of two events with Diane Croft. The next one will be 2 weeks from today. And so I hope you will join us. And I'm just going to put in the chat the link so that you can register and receive the Zoom information. If you haven't registered by 10:30 this morning, you won't receive the information. So please, 10:30 this morning, U.S. Eastern Time. So here is the link. All right, so there's the link, and I hope that you will join us. And good morning, Jiro. Welcome, and it's just you and me for commentary this morning so far, anyway. So I hope you'll be free to make some comments. So I am today going to continue on with the next segment of The Unseen Partner, Love and Longing in the Unconscious by Diane Croft. And I'm reading this book in tandem with A Mystical Path Less Traveled, a Jungian Psychological Perspective by Dr. Jerry R. Wright. Jerry Wright is a retired Presbyterian minister, and he is a Jungian analyst. Diane Croft has a master's degree and worked for many years for the Braille Society, I think. And probably do better than that if I try. Maybe not. Anyway, so as you'll recall from previous sessions, Diane's book is set up with facing pages, and in each facing page there is a poem, and then an image, and then a quote, and then Diane's commentary about what this particular section is referring to. And so today, the section we're beginning with is the path, or I'm sorry, not the path, the bath. It's early. Okay, so reading from Diane's book now, The Bath. I'm ready to turn the faucets off. It's been fun, a veritable bubble bath, but I'm drowning now. The water is too high. The suds are gone. The air is ice. What was pleasure is pain. I want to close my eyes, stop paddling like a dog, return to my days of slumber. Rest, child, it's over. Do you promise? Forget the promise. And then the image is Titan's Goblet from 1833 by Thomas Cole, 1801 to 1848. It's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. That's the image. And the quote is from Rosarium Philosophorum. The quote says, "This stinking water contains everything it needs." And then Diane's commentary. The bath. In religious traditions, submersion in water, i.e. a baptism, is considered to be a form of rebirth by water and the spirit. John 3:5. From a Jungian perspective, baptism symbolizes the descent of the consciousness into the unconscious, resulting in a psychological rebirth into a new and fuller life. This poem feels more like a drowning. I am come into deep waters where the floods overflow me. Psalm 69:2. I am being flooded with too much archetypal energy without understanding its source or how to regulate it. I certainly could have benefited from a wise elder who had gone before, a good shepherd type to guide me through troubled waters. Jungian theory suggests that the outcome of an immersion is in the self, be it liberating or destructive, depends on the attitude of the ego. If the ego accepts its vocation as the conscious vehicle of the transpersonal energies of the self, it might be rescued. An authoritative voice shows up in the poem, offering a brief respite. Rest, child, it's over. But there are no promises. Forget the promise. We can drown in these waters or be reborn. Psalm 69 begins, "Save me, O God, for the waters are come in unto my soul." And so here we're talking about maybe the overwhelming feeling of childhood, of, boy, there's just too much. And even in my lifetime, the amount of information that we have to integrate into our lives has grown exponentially, and it can really be frightening. And I remember as a boy, I was often pulled up by the roots and moved across the country or something like that. I was raised with my father in the U.S. Navy, and so I went to 13 schools in 17 years, and I had to replant myself each time. And in each place, the experiences were different, the people were different, and one had to find their balance. And so I think that it's probably true that because of that experience, and only that part of the experience, I became an introvert. I became interested in the inner self rather than the external self more, although I certainly learned to play the external game also. And hello to Art Patterson. Thank you for coming, Art. Welcome. Jiro, do you have any comment you want to make on the bath? Okay, maybe not. All right. So part of the point of this segment about the bath also relates to alchemy. That's why she's quoted Rosarium Philosophorum here, because anytime, as a mentor of mine once told me, anytime you bring a new person into a group or that person leaves the group changes, or a person leaves the group changes. And another piece of advice I heard once, happens that it was on the Far East Network in Tokyo, which was an American military radio network, but we could get it all over Japan. And on Sunday mornings, they would have Father Harry of the God Squad on the radio. And he had many pieces of wisdom, of course. But one of his that I remember clearly is if you think you're indispensable, then take a bucket and fill it up with water. Then take your fist and put it down deep into that bucket of water. And after you've done that, then take your fist out of the water. And the hole that's left there is how much you will be missed when you're gone. and so the point being that none of us are indispensable. And, some of us, like me being at my ripe old age now, can offer thoughts, but those thoughts are going to be carried forward by other people, not by me. And I fully recognize that, and I wish you well with that. Okay, so, but we have all we need. We always do. And, the point also is that, none of us are here alive without having had everything we needed to be alive in every minute of our lives. And so when we're infants, our mothers provide us with what we need. And if you're watching this, you certainly have what you need as well. And so if you recognize that, then you can take a deep breath, look around you and say, okay, now what would I like to do next or have next? And then take that step. It's one step at a time. And Jiro says, and can relate also to your story, still rummaging my desk for a bit. I'll try to go video a little later. There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liz, dear Lisa. Yeah, and sometimes there is a hole in the bucket. I acknowledge that. So away we go. All right. So I'm going to switch over now to Jerry Wright's book, A Mystical Path Less Traveled. Dr. Wright is being quite the iconoclast, I guess we would say here. And so I think we need to take heed of his message, certainly. And so he has, this book is arranged in, journal entries separated by little images there. I guess those are leaves. So they're journal entries and by poems. Now, Dr. Wright will be with us next Sunday at the same time, 2 p.m., same time as we'll have Diane today. And I think he's going to allow me to live stream that, I hope, and you'll have the opportunity to question him at that time. But anyway, so here's the first journal entry. Journal. Patriarchal religion, culture, and politics will never be healed or transformed as long as we are devoted to the one and only extreme. I'm sorry, I have to start this over again. I'm going to start the sentence and the journal entry again. Patriarchal religion, culture, and politics will never be healed or transformed as long as we are devoted to a one and only external male deity who has a one and only son who is the one and only savior of mankind. No matter how we try to reform the old religious paradigm or to spin it with renewed or progressive interpretations, the patriarchal roots remain. We must accept that the patriarchal temple has collapsed. Some are still sorting through the rubble, trying to find signs of life. Others have turned their heads pretending not to see. Still others are searching for new sources of nourishment for soul beyond religion and spirituality. Others of us are searching for mystical roots, not of religions, but of life itself, keeping company with mystical poets like Rilke. I live my life in widening circles that reach out across the world. I may not complete this last one, but I give myself to it. A circle around God, around the primordial tower. I've been circling for thousands of years, and I still don't know. I am a falcon of a storm of a great song. I'm sorry. I am a falcon, a storm, or a great song. And that's from Rainer Maria Rilke. You know, I hate to say it, but I think that he's right. At least Christianity and Protestant Christianity, as I know it, is not nourishing for me any longer. And, you know, I find myself going to the chapel at the U.S. Naval Academy occasionally, but I always go there alone because I find the building itself sacred. But when I go there and I hear a fundamentalist Navy chaplain, and unfortunately the chaplain corps of the Navy has been taken over by fundamentalists, and I hear them harangue about some idea, you must believe this or you must believe that or you're going to hell, that just doesn't ring true to me any longer. And you must do anything to save your sacred soul. And what you need to do is find your center, and that's a significant element of Diane's work. Individuation. Once you individuate, once you really know who you are, then you're going to have everything revolve around you, which is correct. And it doesn't mean you're going to be an egoistic narcissist. Our former president never got to this depth of soul, unfortunately for him. And he became the poster boy of materialism, where he got every material thing he could ever want by hook or by crook. But what he didn't find in all that getting is happiness. And, there are plenty of people now that are realizing that. Good evening, Nick. Nice to see you here today. Nick Chan on the YouTube channel is my friend in Singapore, and he and I are planning to go to the Aeronos conference together in a year's time. We were going to go last year, but we didn't make it because of COVID. Okay, so I'm going to go back to The Unseen Partner by Diane Croft. And the topic for this page is Bury Me. It's called Bury Me. Here's the poem. If I should die while living, who will bury me? Who will see the empty space where I stood? Who will care if I wash my hair till it shines in the sun when the clouds move aside and heaven wakes? Is this peace or death or both? And the image is hourglass with wings, which is on a tombstone. And it's at Natalettes Cemetery, France, photo by Rosemary, 2006. The quote that goes to this The Mystery of the Conjunctio by Edward Edinger. The ego experiencing itself as dying is very often the prelude to the birth of awareness of the self. And then Diane's comment. Bury Me. This stage marks a series of poems about death and dying, many more than are included in this collection. What I didn't know until much later was that an encounter with the transpersonal self is experienced symbolically as a death, and later, hopefully, a rebirth. Speaking in Jungian terms, the old order, the ego-dominated psyche, must die to make way for a new conscious relationship of trust with the autonomous self, and a commitment to live one's own unique life. But every stage in the evolution of consciousness feels like a death. The ending stanzas, is this peace or death? Both reflect the paradoxical nature of the objective psyche. Wherever consciousness polarizes the world into pairs of opposites, e.g., positioning life and death as diametrically opposed to each other in the greater totality of the self, they coexist. These symbolic poems about death foretold a descent into the unconscious, into the realm of the underworld. This is Dante's descent into hell and purgatory. Quote, in the middle of the road of my life, I awoke in the dark wood where the true way was wholly lost, unquote. Strangely enough, assuming one survives the ordeal, it promises a peace that truly passeth all understanding. Quote, die while you're alive and be absolutely dead. Then do whatever you want. It's all good. That's from Zen master Bunan of the 17th century. Now, the point is that we think that our ego is, we may be God's gift to the world. And, in fact, we aren't. And learning that can feel like death. Learning that you're never going to be president of the United States or never be a congressman, it can feel like death. And when I was a boy, I thought, wow, I'll be president someday, or wow, I'll be a congressman someday. And then circumstances intercede. I mean, they didn't in the case of our former president, but he was all ego and no self. And he was all persona ego, not real ego, because in his case, and in all cases of bullies, my father told me a truth that I will share with you, and you can take it to the bank. I've used it since I was 10 years old, and it is a hard-boiled egg is always yellow inside. And I certainly see signs of that in our former president, but you have to see them for yourself. And I asked a friend of mine who's a psychologist here in my home state, and was told that he has a teeny weeny little ego. He actually has a teeny ego, but he puts this big bluster out in front of himself as a self-protection, and to protect his teeny weeny little ego. And he clearly has never connected to the self. And the result is starting to come due on him. And in some sense, I feel sorry for him. So anyway, let's see. Okay, all right. So I'm going to go back to the mystical path. But before I do, I just want to add one thing, and that is that this particular page about the realizing the self and this rebirth of the deep self, the God image within each one of us, is like being born again. And it may be that some Christian faiths have latched on to that and that feeling. I don't know enough about their teachings to know that, but of course they're not teaching you about yourself. They're teaching you about Christ, who is this external person that they keep referring to, and what Dr. Jung is talking about is you. And so you need to be reborn. And once you do that, then life is enough and you can be quite happy. And I've certainly faced death quite a few times in my life, and when I recover from that or get through that, life is more sweet when you understand that your being is not going to continue, but you can do things that will make you, in effect, immortal. And as we talk about Dr. Jung, for example, we just mentioned his name and his spirit is here with us. The same with Jesus Christ, of course. He's immortal also, in spirit. They're both here in spirit. And they both knew that their spirit would live on after them. And so they could die quite satisfied, if not, in the case of Christ, his humanity came through on the occasion on the cross when he said, Father, why hast thou forsaken me? Because what he meant was, why can't you let me die instead of suffering as I am here on the cross? And so that proved the fact that he was the God-man, because the rest of his ministry is about God and his relationship to God. A relationship, by the way, that Dr. Jung pointed out, we all have, whether son or daughter, we are all related in that way. All right, so going back to Jerry Wright's journal entries, and Jerry has a number of very powerful and important poems in his book, but he asked me not to read them, so I'm not reading them, but he will be here to read them personally next Sunday. Okay, journal. I had an insight yesterday about our preoccupation with guns and our nation's difficulty dealing with gun safety and gun controls. As long as unconscious men exercise religious, cultural, and political power, they will protect their phallic symbols: guns, knives, missiles, spires, and towers. Unconscious men are caught in boy and cowboy psychology, strutting around with a gun on their hip and a phallus in their head. The male penis, the one between the legs, is made for pleasure and reproduction and intimacy. The unconscious penis, the one in the head, is intent on power and control. And by God, no one had better mess with that one. Well, that's quite a timely journal entry, obviously. And, ask my friends. I have several high school friends who are fanatic about their guns. One of them has 50 guns, and they say, he says something like, uh, what if the government comes and tries to take away my guns? At least I'll be able to defend myself. Well, no, you won't. Your government has tanks and F-18s and way more firepower than you do. And so you're not going to protect yourselves with guns. And in point of fact, it's a statistical truth that you're 17 times more likely to die from gun violence if you have a gun in the house. And so I urge us to rethink our whole view about guns per se. Wearing a gun around the office, as that tax collector down in Florida did. Well, we see where his mind was, don't we? Because he's going to jail for trafficking minors and other things like that. And so, Jerry's right on point on this. And, I spent 23 years in the Marine Corps, and we think of the Marines as being very tough and smart. But we don't allow Marines to carry guns around except when absolutely necessary in combat. Otherwise, the guns are left in the armory, and they're locked up. And so you don't actually have to have a gun in hand to be tough. And when I was in Vietnam, I was a first lieutenant at the time. And so I did carry a 45 caliber pistol on my hip on occasion. But the only time I fired it in Vietnam was one day we were out next to a pond, and there was a beer can floating in the pond, and I fired five rounds at this beer can. Didn't hit it any of the times I fired the pistol, so the pistol couldn't have been that good. But when you're unless you're in an actual firefight, it's not necessarily a good idea to be carrying a weapon around. And I just think of when what's her name? The woman whose husband is astronaut Captain Kelly, who became a U.S. Senator from Arizona, but she was in Congress, and her name escapes me for the moment. But when she was attacked by one or two gunmen, there was a man with a pistol in the liquor store right next door. And he came running out of the place, but he did not draw his weapon. And he was very wise not to draw his weapon, because in the chaos of that event, if the police had seen this civilian running around with a pistol, they might well have killed him, but they didn't, because he was smart enough not to take his pistol out of its holster. And that's the point. You don't know in the chaos of a moment who anyone is. And just as the National Rifle Association makes you think that you'd be able to protect yourself if you have a gun, actually, chances are you wouldn't, because the police may come and think you're one of the people that's causing the problem. And so we just have to rethink that. And we need to remember why do gun lawsuits never get to the Supreme Court? Well, they can't, because if they get to the Supreme Court, the justices of the Supreme Court would have to give cognizance to the First 4 words of the Second Amendment, which is a well-regulated militia. And so the point about the Second Amendment was it was intended to protect us in the form of a well-regulated militia. It was not intended to let any Tom, Dick, and Harry run around with an Uzi or AK-47 or whatever it is, an AR-15. That was never the intention of the Founding Fathers. And if a case about guns ever went to the Supreme Court, the justices of the Supreme Court would have to recognize that. And so, the Second Amendment does not give us the right to have unlimited arms in our house. And if anything, they make our lives more dangerous. And so I just urge you to rethink some of those ideas if you have them. And so moving on, hello, Jaguar Focus, welcome. So now I'm going to go back to Diane Croft's book, and keep in mind that this book I consider to be a primer on individuation. In other words, it is, these are the types of things that happen to you in your psyche over a lifetime. And they happen to all of us. And Diane has beautifully expressed these things so that we can see them and recognize them for what they are when they happen. And so the title of this segment is Barren. And you can see this person is feeling quite barren in this image. And so Diane's poem. What am I to be left with? Nothing? A dry hole without a drop of water? Barren without a child? A ghost of what I was when I pretended to be someone. Leave me something. And the painting is entitled Silence from 1799 to 1801 by Johann Heinrich Füssli of Switzerland, and it's from the York Project. So there's Barren. The quote that Diane found from St. John of the Cross, Dark Night of the Soul. It is meet then that the soul be first of all brought into emptiness. And so, the point is that life is not all unicorns and rainbows. Barren. An acute sense of alienation and a cry for salvation resonate throughout this poem. This is the dark night of the soul, where life feels emptied of psychic content and meaning. What right have I to live? Although alienation is an archetypal event, it is experienced in the extremes among those for whom the ego-self relationship is severely damaged, most likely from childhood. To break out of the alienated state, the ego-self relationship must be repaired, which means that the ego must relinquish its original omnipotent identification with the self and recognize it as a separate autonomous force within the psyche. If the emptied or non-inflated ego can survive this barren period of transition and sustain its own integrity, it opens itself to the possibility of giving birth to new life. The final sentence, leave me something, feels less like a plea and more like a pronouncement that the ego not only expects, but demands support from its unseen partner. Clinically, this is called alienation neurosis. Okay, so the point is that there is a driving force, and form within the psyche, which is more powerful than our ego. And it is going to dictate what we become and what our contribution will be. And it applies to every creature, every living creature on Earth. So within the acorn are all the plans necessary for the oak tree to emerge as this particular oak tree. And every oak tree is different. Every human being is different. And so we don't know how you will emerge. And part of that is an environmental issue and a circumstance issue. What happens is, you might be a wonderful gymnast, and suddenly you have an auto accident in which you lose an arm. And well, you're not going to be a gymnast anymore, at least not in the main Olympics. You might be in the Paralympic Games. And so the point is, when things happen, yourself is going to develop you further. And obviously people who do lose an arm, or what have you in their lifetimes, find other things to, yourself comes through and gives you something else to work on. And in The Sound of Music movie, the Mother Superior says, when God closes a door, he opens a window. And, that has happened to me quite a few times in my life. But, at one point I thought I might become a colonel or a general officer in the Marine Corps. And then one fine day I was walking across an icy parking lot on Marine Corps base Quantico, and I slipped on the ice. Not very heroic at all. I slipped on the ice, and I looked down, and there was my foot, not on my leg. It was sticking out from my leg. And I had broken my leg. And I began the decade of the 1990s that way. And so it was obvious from that point that I was not going to be a Marine Corps colonel or a general. And so that was the last thing I did in uniform. And so myself had to figure out what it was going to do next. And so the military was kind enough to repair my broken leg, which was very good. And although I had a prosthesis inserted into my ankle for the rest of my life, and about 3 years ago, I had to have that ankle replaced entirely. But 3 months after the original break, I began a business which 15 years later became the largest company in its industry and was a public company. And it gave me the opportunity to travel around the world many, many times. I've flown literally around the world at least 75 times in my lifetime. And most of those times came after I broke my ankle. And so this opportunity that was presented to me by myself at that time, ended up being the starting point of something much, much greater for my own career, which I had no clue would ever happen when that break took place. And so you learn to be humble, and then you learn what it is that yourself can offer you to move you on. And we all have dark nights of the soul like that. As I said, I've had many. after 15 years with my company, I basically got pushed out of my company by my partners. And so a couple of years later, I began to do my Jungian work, which now has been over 10 years. I've been doing the Archetype in Action website since 2010, and this YouTube channel for the last 5 years. And, this is what myself has told me to do, and I love doing it. And it's not the Marine Corps, but and so I don't get to wear medals and badges and insignia of rank, and yet it gives me more pleasure and comfort than that might have done. I know lots of Marines who retire when they're 40 or 45 and are basically washed up as men, and they go off and drink themselves to death or smoke themselves to death, whatever it is. So we need to, we have to know that we will be broken by one thing or another in our lives, and then we learn what it is to live within the context of whatever has happened to us, and something wonderful can emerge and flower from that new thing. And just like an oak tree where it has a limb that happens to be in the way of the telephone line, and so therefore some telephone company comes along and saws off this limb to allow the phone line to go through the oak tree, and the oak tree just goes on. It will push through a new shoot even out of the stump, and it will also, apply its energy to another part of the tree. So it's a phenomenon of all life, and we have to know that. And it's a question of having faith. It's not belief. There's a difference between belief and faith. Belief is somebody else is telling you something and you're believing it, whether for better or for worse. But faith is knowing. Faith is knowing that if something bad happens, something new will emerge and bring forward a new life for you. And so, as long as you can breathe, that can happen. So now I'll go back to Jerry Wright's book, journal entry. When religions are uprooted from the natural world in favor of a natural one, and their myths are literalized, their roots bleed to death. When the blood of Jesus is literalized as an antidote for sin and a literal cup of salvation, as is the case for many, religious meaning bleeds. As is the case for many, religious meaning bleeds to death. Rootless entities, whether religious or cultural, cannot thrive or survive. And so the point is that the point is my often stated point about the logos and the eros. The logos, the word, is not alive. There's no word that is alive. And we have to understand the message of John 1 through 12, at least, where in the first verse it says, in the beginning was the word. Well, fine, we need the words to create civilization, which we have done. And so modern religions have created structures upon which we can live our lives, but they are not life. And there's nothing alive in materialism. We live our lives on the other side, in chaos and eros, in eros. The opposite of logos is eros. So everything that you can see in my image behind me, including my spectacles and my shirt and all those things. We need logos, 100% for that, because with the logos, we can create the plans that will allow us to build my wife's computer here, and the lamp there, and the koto, the koto that's there, that's a Japanese musical instrument. And so we need the logos to provide us with the structure upon which we can live our lives. But none of that is alive. The only thing that's alive about that koto is when my wife puts it on the floor and starts to play it. And then life emerges from it. And so we have to recognize that, we've been dissing Eros for several hundred years in the West and saying, oh, you have to live by these strict rules, and everything has to be hunky-dory according to the rules. Well, no, it doesn't. And life is lived the way Diane Croft is pointing it out to us. And so we have to recognize that everything that's material is not alive, and we live our lives on the other side in Eros. And so in Eros, there is chaos. Yes, there's chaos. And the Logos allows us to understand chaos. So gradually, item by item, we're able to pick up the chaos and understand it. And so we've come to understand lots of things, but there's nothing alive in the Logos. And so, that's the point. If we expect that the myths of the Bible are literally physically true, and then they no longer speak to us, then they bleed to death. And this is what's happened to certainly the Christian church. I can't say for other religions, but I believe that. And so even if I go to the Bhagavad Gita, which I read over the summer with Khushbu Kantaria, the Bhagavad Gita has a wonderful story and lots of wonderful practical advice for life. But it's basically a story. And so unless you put life into it and actually read it or listen to someone else read it, then it's just a book. Then it's just an orange doorstop on your bookshelf. And the same is true of a Bible, of course. So anyway. All right. So now I'll go back to Diane. Covered barren. The next point that she makes is do not ask. Okay, whoops. Do not ask in her book. And her poem given to her by God is, when roses bloom, they do not ask permission. They open wide their mouths to the sun, and then they die. And she's given us the rose window from Strasbourg Cathedral, France. And there's the rose window. And of course, rose windows appear in many cathedrals and churches throughout the world. The quote here is from C.G. Jung's Psychology of the Unconscious, which was the earlier version of his book, now in the collected works, called Symbols of Transformation. Here's the quote. Through the excess of his longing, he draws down the divine into the corruption of his passion. Therefore, he seems to raise himself to the divine But with that, his humanity is destroyed. Okay, let me read Diane's commentary. Do not ask. This poem signals a willingness to open myself up to these transpersonal energies without questioning why, a certain readiness to risk all in pursuit of a larger life. I don't mean to imply this was a conscious decision at the time. Because I assumed this poem was about death, I originally typed rose plus tombstone in Wikimedia Commons and selected an image of a stone rose carved on a tombstone to complement the poem. But every time I saw the two together, something felt wrong. This poem embodies the courage to be open to the world, to be alive. So I simplified the search to rose, and this striking rose window appeared, which I later recognized as a mandala image. Mandala is a Sanskrit word for circle, a symbol of unity that represents a synthesis of the opposites within the psyche. Jung considers it to be the symbol of the self. Edinger explains how, in the psychotherapy of adults, the unconscious may produce a mandala image which conveys a sense of calm and containment to a disordered and confused ego, indicating that the self stands behind the ego and can act as a guarantor of its integrity. I don't want to minimize the dangers inherent in an experience that destroys the centrality of the ego. But if the ego is up to the task, there is an opportunity at midlife to open wide to the sun. Well, there's so much there, but it relates to faith rather than belief. In other words, you have to open yourself to what life can bring. And often it can bring something that's amazing and excellent that you hadn't thought of before. And it doesn't mean you have to believe anybody's doctrine or dogma. It means that all the religions have been avenues to get to the self, to the soul, to your very deepest, the deepest part of yourself. But when they insist on the literal as opposed to how it's affecting within you, then they become concretized and they're no longer alive. And that's the issue. That's the issue that Jerry is getting to here as well, that you can't, if you concretize things, they will not stay alive, and then you just move on. It's like my neighbor who has a boat called Never Enough, and Donald Trump is the poster boy for never enough because he's acquired and acquired and acquired until it's actually too much, but it still has not brought him happiness. So he was happily flying around the world in his airplane with his name on it back when he was running for president, but now that airplane is rather forlorn, sitting on a runway up on Long Island, and it's unflyable at the moment. And so unless he can find a way to breathe life back into it, it's dead. Okay, so going back now to Jerry, A Mystical Path Less Traveled, a Jungian Psychological Perspective. Journal. Our uprooted religions are a direct consequence of our being uprooted from the natural world itself. Furthermore, Religious myths that suggest we are separate from and superior to nature grant further permission to live with the destructive delusions. Michael McCarthy, the British naturalist and author of The Moth Snowstorm, reminds us that the natural world is our mother, our home, and the resting place for our psyches, our souls. In an arresting comparison that comes from evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology, he says that while we have had some 500 generations of civilization, some 12,000 years, we had 50,000 generations when we were essentially wildlife. That older legacy continues to flow in our bodies and may be more important for our psyches than the more recent generations of so-called civilization. He notes that we may have left the natural world, but the natural world has not left us. The neglect and the destruction of the natural world have a direct effect both on our body and psyche, likely more so than we have thus far imagined. That is a pretty dramatic statistic that we've had 500 generations of civilization, but there were 50,000 generations of civilization before now. And, you know, this is one of the points that Dr. Jung makes quite clearly in the Red Book and throughout his 20 volumes of the collected works, which is that life will find a way. And so, you know, as I suggested, when something terrible happens to you, like breaking a leg or losing a leg or something like that, life finds a way to do something with you and your ego, and helps you find a way through it. And we need to be better connected with the natural part of our life. And that's, you know, a fundamental tenet of Jungian psychology. And so no matter how bad things get in your life, life will find a way to bring you something that will lead you to happiness and satisfaction. Except that one day you'll die, and you don't have to worry about dying, because as my Buddhist teachers have taught, you don't have to worry about dying. Everyone dies, and everybody will do it just right. And so you have to decide what you're going to do between now and then. And as I quipped to my father when he was a bag of bones in a hospital in upstate New York, and he thought he was dying, and I said, don't worry about that. We have 110 billion people who've tried it. We have no complaints. And so the point is, when you're dead, you don't know you're dead. It's only difficult for your family. When you're stupid, it works the same way. And if you keep that tenet in mind, then you can be happy in this life, and you don't have to worry about the next life, because the next life, you know, Dr. Jung is currently in his next life, namely that we're talking about him today. And so his spirit is still with us and immortal. But that fact has done precious little for his physical life. I mean, he's dead and still dead. And He doesn't know he's dead, and therefore his spirit lives on with us. And so it's kind of graveyard humor, but you have to rock that graveyard humor in order to live satisfactorily. Okay, so going back, and so here's Diane, and her next section is called Certain Death. Comments on a theme. So Diane says, lay upon me the cross of my certain death. I wait only for the soldiers to pound their angry nails into my feet, my hands, that I might forgive them and be made holy. And the image is workshop of Hans Mulcher about 1440. And this is an early dissection that's being depicted in this image that she's put in here. And the quote she has is Peter at his crucifixion, quote, I will not keep silent the mystery of the cross, which was once hidden from my soul. Let not the cross be for you that which it appears, for it is another thing. And so that's what Peter said. Diane's comment, certain death. I was greatly surprised to find myself writing about a crucifixion, especially my own. As a non-practicing Protestant, I'm ritually tone deaf to the symbolism of the cross, the Blessed Virgin Mary, the saints, and the lot. Yet here I am nailed to the cross, and none too unhappy about it. This poem and many others that spontaneously produced religious motifs made me appreciate Jung's discovery that the psyche is, by nature, religious. I found many remarkable psychological interpretations of Christ's crucifixion, but I am limiting this amplification to the one I found most meaningful. It is an image of conscious suffering, suffering, that painful feeling we all try to avoid, understood in the larger context, means a willingness to bear our own burdens in life, an acceptance of life as it is, a natural conflict of opposites that takes on meaning when we attempt to balance it ethically. To quote Jung at some length, quote, we Protestants must sooner or later face this question. Are we to understand the imitation of Christ in the sense that we should copy his life and, if I may use this expression, ape his stigmata, or in the deeper sense that we are to live our own proper lives as truly as he lived his in its individual uniqueness? It is no easy matter to live a life that is modeled on Christ's, but it is unspeakably harder to live one's own life as truly as Christ lived his. And that's really a profound idea, that we can have terrible things happen to us, and yet we have to go on with our life and live our lives as truly as we possibly can, and the life that we are given. And sometimes it's difficult to face that life as we're given, but nonetheless, we have to do so. And, just in my case, for example, I'm nearly 75 years old now, and I've been diagnosed with prostate cancer. And so the solution to that is radiation treatment of my prostate. And assuming I successfully get through all that, then then I might live on for another 20 or 25 years, I suppose. And I certainly intend to do that. But right now, as I face the next 4 months or 5 months, I have 4 major medical procedures ahead of me. And they don't seem that appealing because in the workup for my radiation treatment, I learned that I have a hiatal hernia. And I've had a hiatal hernia in the past, and it's not a good thing, as my surgeon told me. There's no hernia that's good. And a hiatal hernia means that there's a tear in your diaphragm, which is the muscle that causes your lungs to breathe. And if that tears apart, then you won't be able to breathe. And so a hiatal hernia is one of the more serious ones. And so in the course of preparing for radiation treatment, I learned a good thing. Apparently, the cancer has not spread through my body, so the radiation will probably work. But in the course of finding that good news, I got the bad news that I have another hiatal hernia. And so I'll have to talk to the doctor about that next Tuesday. And so we have to just take our lives as we live them. And besides that, I was planning to have my hip replaced on May the 6th, but because of the prostate issue, I have to get that fixed before I have my hip replaced, and therefore I have to continue to live with the pain of a hip that's no longer working properly for another several months before I can get it treated. I probably will be able to get it replaced in September, I suppose. So my next few months aren't looking like they're going to be that joyous from a visit to doctor's point of view. But nonetheless, I'm committed to going on living it and sharing my perspectives with all of you. So I hope I find that useful. Now, I do want to remind everyone that this afternoon at 2 p.m., Diane Croft is going to be speaking to us live. I've promised her that we will not record the session and it will not be live streamed on YouTube. So if you wish to hear her live, her topic is experiences of God in the individuation process. So she's actually going to talk about the experiences she had, which led to this book, The Unseen Partner. And so it will not be recorded, it will not be replayed. And if you want to attend, you have to have the Zoom link and join us on Zoom. And so I've just now put on the YouTube channel, and I'll put it here on the Zoom chat as well for convenience. The link to the mailing list that I have, which does provide the coordinates for hearing Diane live. And so if you are watching this now and you have not registered for the Wisdom Path Colloquia, please click on that link immediately and go sign up, so that at 10:30 this morning, my time, which is 75 minutes from now, when I send out the last notice of today's talk about Diane, I hope that you will already be on the mailing list so that you receive the coordinates for that session. Yeah, I'm sorry you can't make it, Nick. It's going to be a good session, but in any case, Moving on with Jerry Croft now. Or I'm sorry, not Jerry Croft, Jerry Wright. Getting my authors confused here. Okay, so this is another journal entry from Jerry. When deities and devils are rightly understood as human creations and mirrors of yet to be known and yet to be owned aspects of human capacities for creativity and destruction, we will have discovered the mystical path toward home as a species. Such a path will require us to live more responsibly, not less so as some fear. Laws that are written on the human heart or psyche are far more persuasive than those written in ancestral texts deemed sacred, or the laws emanating from church councils or political bickering. We must recover the individual art of soul making from the big business of religion. Religions that continue to export their deities and devils to heaven and hell have become religious corporations too narrow of mind and too big to fail. Oh, man. Well, Jerry's absolutely right. And so Jerry Wright is right. And we see these big corporate religions on the television or wherever all the time. And what they're doing is they're treating religion like a circus. And they have psychological tricks that have worked very well. And as many of you know, I had the experience once of having my daughter tell me that I was going to hell. And within 45 minutes or an hour of her telling me that, I had a vision of Mephistopheles plopping down in the seat next to me. And probably the vision lasted 5 to 10 seconds, which is a good thing because I was traveling at 65 miles an hour down the highway. But from that experience, I know very well that you can have an actual vision of the devil showing up, because we've had many, let's call them logos, versions of the devil presented to us in imagery in movies and television programs. And in this case, I envisioned the Mephistopheles from Faustus, which is the Mephistopheles I had imagined when I was reading Faustus in college. And so he appeared to me. And of course, that was a psychological vision, but nonetheless, it was quite real. And, you know, it could have caused a car accident quite easily. Fortunately, but I made the Faustian bargain, which was he could have my immortal soul on my desk, provided none of my daughters believed that of me for the rest of my life. And that was in 1998. And he's kept his part of the bargain. He disappeared immediately after I made that bargain and never came back. But what I know from that experience is that, you know, these Bible thumping preachers who, you know, tell you you're going to hell, or, you know, they're playing with snakes on the stage or whatever it is, they can manipulate your psyche in a way that will cause you to follow them and give your money to those people and that sort of thing. And it can be quite scary. And so I'm sure that during medieval times and before and after, if they thump the Bible hard enough and express an image of the devil hard enough, sure enough, you can have a vision, and that might scare you into the church, into putting your money into the church. And, you know, when my daughter said that to me, I was furious, and not at my daughter. And keep in mind that it's the devil's trick when you blame your child for something that somebody else did. And so I was furious with the leaders of a church that would teach a child to say such a thing to their parent. It's irresponsible. And so, it could quite easily have led me to be quite angry with my daughter. And it took me 10 years to get over it. And I only got over it by studying Dr. Jung in very great detail over a decade. And so it could have destroyed my relationship with my daughter. However, and that's the devil's trick, which is to, somebody pulls something like that, and then they cause you to blame your daughter or your spouse or something, when in fact the cause was something else. And Dr. Ann Belford Ulanoff talks about the devil's trick and how the devil can mislead you into doing something. For example, in our political debates right now, okay, a lot of us are not pleased with what's happened in the last 4 years. I would say a majority of Americans are not pleased, regardless of our political stripe. But we have to not blame our relatives who may have been persuaded by silly ideas, but we have to give credit where credit is due. And so, I don't even necessarily blame Donald Trump, because I know that he is a flawed individual who has a teeny weeny ego that he's protecting. And so I blame the whole last 200 years that have caused us to become materialistic and making a religion out of the things that we own. But the things aren't what make us happy. And so, regardless of what car I have out in the parking lot, it still just has 4 wheels and gets me where I'm going. So whether I drive my mother-in-law's 2002 car or my new Toyota Prius, they're quite different, as you might guess, because one of them is nearly 20 years old. But in point of fact, they both do exactly the same thing. And so we can't put priority on such things when the thing that's important is the fact that we can live our lives through moving about, being more mobile through automobiles, whether they're 50 years old or 5 minutes old. And so we need to put things in right context in our lives. Okay, going back to Diane Croft, The Unseen Partner, Love and Longing in the Unconscious. And the next section, mind you, when I get a new book, I always open it randomly. And I find very frequently that there's a synchronicity about the page that I open to. And the page I opened to when Diane first sent me this book is Overturning. And what this is a painting of a kayaker in a very large wave. And the reason that's significant is that my friend Tim Holmes spent all last summer and fall, in fact, most of last year, painting images of seas being very wildly stormy. And in one case, he had an image of a tsunami going across the mountains with a freighter on the top of the tsunami. I actually bought the painting because I liked it so much, but this overturning is exactly and archetypally on that point, and so I found it quite interesting. So here's what Diane says. The sea was restless, churning, torn apart by the elements that would not let her be. She struck a small fishing boat, heaved it over like a toddler who's lost his balance. Later, calm prevailed. The sea, a shining mirror of heaven, showed no sign of remorse. Why? She looked happy. And the image is Kayaking the Unconscious from 2007 by Stephen Parker in Alaska. Kayaking the Unconscious. And Edward Edinger's quote from The Christian Archetype. The birth of the self is a catastrophic, literally overturning event, an archetypal dynamism fraught with danger and violence. And so the point is that when this happens, you have to recognize that it's happening to you and have faith that you will pass through it. And I'm sure lots of young people commit suicide because they have been overturned in some way and they can't get themselves out of it. And so that's why I like Jung, because in my reading of Jung over now 34 years, I've found that he always helped me find my bearings. That's the point. Okay, so here's Diane's comment. Overturning. I went to get a haircut an hour or so after this poem came forth and found myself unexpectedly reciting it to the hairdresser. She called over another stylist, and soon I was reciting it to the whole salon. None of us understood what it meant, but we knew it touched something deep inside. The small ego self, accurately depicted in Parker's painting as a teeny tiny kayaker, is valiantly attempting to remain upright in the primordial sea of the unconscious, which is hell-bent on shaking things up. Notice the dramatic spiraling effect of the waves, much like this process Jungians use to describe the evolution of selfhood as a spiral, circling around a transpersonal center to higher and higher states of consciousness. Still, the kayaker is holding steady. The ego must stay strong as this critical stage of individuation. If the ego is destroyed, as is the conscious manifestation of the self within that individual, so is the conscious manifestation of the self within the ego. The self gives birth to the ego, and now the ego must give birth to the self in order to let her be in the world. And what I think of is that society, the collective unconscious, which Dr. Jung refers to as God, also goes through this. So the collective unconscious of each country, let's say, or each group or what have you, each family emerges in a certain way. A family has a certain self about it, and this is true about the United States. And so in the case of the United States and the collective, I have spent my whole life believing and having faith in the country. I never have I've never doubted the development of the country toward better and better ideas, but it's quite painful, as we know, and certainly it's been quite painful in my lifetime. But we see a classic example of this where the people who attacked the Capitol on January the 6th thought that they were patriots, and they're former Marines, just like me, some of them. But they had been persuaded by some overturning event that they had to do that. But we can think of the Capitol building and the Congress as the ego of the country. And so when this storm came through and caused this crisis in our country, now the ego has to be strong enough to stand up to that. And so now we see that that is what's happening. And now the people that were creating that storm are being punished and finding out that they were on the wrong track. And so the country isn't going to change just because someone wants to be a dictator in our country. And so I don't know how long it will take the collective, and especially the part of it that supports our former president, to change, but I know that we will all be benefited by the greater consciousness that will emerge from the outcome of what happened on January 6th. Arzt says, they want you to be what they want you to be. Are they hidden in their shadows? Yes, Art, I agree that they're hidden in their shadows, and often we are too. And so we have to become what we will be. And knowing that whatever our physical life brings us, we have to face it with courage and pay attention to what our self wants us to do, or gives us the power to do, whatever that may be. Okay, going back to Jerry Wright's book, A Mystical Path Less Traveled. The body is the first responder to the nearness of the numinous, the sacred, or the mystical other. The mystical experience is, first of all, a bodily event, followed by an emotion, and concluding with a mental acknowledgement or interpretation. Yet monotheistic religions have tended to deny the importance of the body, and more severely to denigrate and pathologize its natural sexual instincts and expressions. In doing so, the body has been seen as an enemy to the experiences of the holy, rather than its closest friend. The mystic honors the body as the first detector and responder to the sacred, embraces psyche as the organ of relationship with the sacred, and experiences oneself as the responsible incarnation of the sacred. A grounded, embodied mystical path replaces religious highways to heaven that seek to bypass the body and the earth. And you've just seen an example of that as I just discussed, this page in Diane Croft's book, where I've opened the book the first time to this particular page, to the overturning, and I immediately recognized it as a connection to what Tim Holmes was experiencing through his art over last year, and understanding that, this is archetypal. And so, our understanding of our country and our belief in our country was overturned on January the 6th. And so now that has happened, now we have to integrate that fact and figure out what it is that its meaning is. That's the way all of this works. And so, there was nothing in the Bible about that. Well, actually, there are things in the Bible about it. I don't want to misspeak, but what I do want to say is that it's not well explained, let's say. And so now we can understand it, we can grok it if we understand these concepts. Okay, so the next section of Diane's book, and I'm going to make this the last one that I do today, is Let Me Be. Okay, and you see this image that she has here. And Diane's poem is, let me rest, let me be lonely, let me be without hope. Let me languish by day and by night, no dreams to chase this despair away. I am this, let me be. And so here's the untitled drawing that Diane has chosen by Geo Milev of Bulgaria, 1895 to 1930. And the quote is a quote of Jung from Mysterium Conjunctionis. The experience of the self is always a defeat for the ego. And so, when you realize that you're not going to be president of the United States, that's certainly a defeat for the ego. Diane's commentary. Let me be. There's a peaceful feeling behind this poem of despair, a minimalist joy in allowing myself to just be. Once the ego accepts its deep and abiding relationship with the transpersonal other, it finds peace in understanding. Edinger explains, as the one begets all things, it cannot be any of them. This means that it is a mistake to identify our individuality with any particular talent, function, or aspect of ourselves. However, very often this is just what we do. If a person feels inferior and depressed in the presence of people who are more intelligent, who have read more books, who have traveled more, who are more famous, or who are more skillful or knowledgeable in art, who have traveled more, who are more famous, or who are more skillful or knowledgeable at art, music, politics, or any other human endeavor, then the person is making the mistake of identifying some particular aspect or function of himself with his essential individuality. If such a person can experience the fact that his individuality and personal worth are beyond all particular manifestation, his security will no longer be threatened by the accomplishments of others. This sense of innate worth, prior to and irrespective of deeds and accomplishments, is the precious deposit that is left in the psyche by the experience of genuine parental love. Lacking this experience, one must laboriously seek out from the depths of the unconscious its inner equivalent, the monad, often symbolized by the mandala. This experience conveys the sense of having a transpersonal basis for being and enables us to feel he has a right to exist as he actually is. And so obviously a very important sentiment that all of us have a right to be exactly as we are. We are all winners of the lottery big time because each of us is the winner of a 3.5 billion year development of life on this planet. And the chances of us existing or not existing were very small. And in my case, my grandfather was engaged to a woman who, together with her 4 sisters, died on the same weekend from the Spanish flu in 1918. And as a result of that fact, my grandfather married my grandmother, and therefore I can exist at all. And so in a backhanded sort of way, pandemic is my friend, because that pandemic 100 years ago made my life possible. And so we're all, although that was obviously quite a sad event for both the world and my grandfather, it nevertheless led to whatever I was in his life, which wasn't necessarily a positive thing from his point of view, maybe. But in any case, the point is that we're all the result of a huge lottery that is beyond numerical counting, and we can be just as we are. And then from that being, we can move forward in our lives. Okay. So there's one more journal entry I'm going to read here. And journal, whatever we attribute to creation's source, whether theological, psychological, or scientific, it has taken up residence within matter, within physical life. This source is so intertwined with matter, molecules, and human flesh as having no separate operational headquarters. The human body is the first responder of our species to the mysteries at the heart of life. As part of the earth itself, the body is the finest tuned mystical instrument available to us. Those religions that deny or denigrate the value of the body, including sexuality, and elevate heaven over earth, are a danger to body and soul. The following 3 trail markers address such dangers. Now, the trail markers that Jerry has mentioned here are poems, and I agreed not to read Jerry's poems. Hopefully he will read these 3 poems next week when he appears at 2 p.m. on April the 18th. But they're quite profound, I have to say that. And so I urge you to find this book, A Mystical Path Less Traveled, a Jungian psychological perspective. Jerry is a retired Presbyterian minister and a Jungian analyst. And so he will be here to talk with us live next Sunday. And I hope you will join us. I've left the link to that session. Or I've left the link to our MailChimp so that you can register for that session and others, and you will be receiving notification of what the coordinates are to listen to Jerry live and maybe ask him some personal questions. Now, I want to emphasize that I'm going to send out a notice about today's presentation by Diane Croft one more time, and I will do that 10:30 a.m. my time, which is Eastern Daylight Time. So if you have registered on the MailChimp account, and peace, Yuan, nice to see you. If you have registered on the MailChimp account for the Wisdom Path Colloquia, you will receive that notice and you'll be able to join the Zoom session. There will be no live stream on YouTube and there will be no replay on YouTube. So if you want to talk with Diane or ask her a question or just hear the numinous experiences that led to her book, The Unseen Partner, you will need to be present in the Zoom session. I have room on my Zoom account for 100 panelists and 400 attendees. So a panelist means that you would be able to be visible on the screen on Zoom, and you would be able to ask questions. If you're an attendee, you may be able to raise your hand and ask a question. I'm not sure about that, but I urge you to be one of the first 100 that logs on. I will probably log on for that event at 1:30 p.m. my time today. And so you'll be able to find a space in the Zoom session by about that time. And you'll need to be one of the first 100 in order to be in the panel and to ask your question directly to Diane. I feel confident that that's going to be a profound session, and I urge you to come and to listen to it. Now, and there will be a second session, as there's part 2 of that, of what she has in her presentation, which will be 2 weeks from today at 2 p.m. And so both of those sessions are important, and I hope you will attend. Now, it would be remiss of me not to note that today is the 52nd anniversary of the death of my roommate from the basic school in the Marines, Robert M. Christian Jr., who gave his life for our country on April the 11th, 1969. And I'm still personally quite grateful for Bob's sacrifice that he made for me, not on the battlefield, but at the basic school. And if you want to read the story of that sacrifice, you can find it on archetypeinaction.com. I think if you put in the search engine Robert M. Christian Jr., it will pop up that story so that you'll understand why it's so meaningful to me. But I thank Bob for his sacrifice and for my entire family, my 3 daughters and my wife and our 10 grandchildren. All of that was made possible by a decision that Bob made back in the early fall of 1968, which led him to the battlefield in Vietnam and led me to the Defense Language Institute, where I learned Mandarin Chinese instead of battling in Vietnam. I did go to Vietnam, but not until a year later. And so I just want to recognize that today is the 52nd anniversary of his death in Vietnam. So that's all I have to say for today. I hope you'll join us this afternoon, and I will be sending out the final notice, which will have the coordinates of Diane's Zoom session at about 10:30 this morning. So If you put yourself on that list before 10:30, you will get the coordinates. If you don't, you won't. And so this is April the 11th, 2021. And this presentation will be live only at 2 p.m. today. So thank you for joining me today. Peace. Take care.